Hey everyone, and welcome back. We need to talk about one of the most explosive turning points Genoa City has seen in a long time. It's a total collision of power, pride, and some really messy history. At the center of it all, we have got Michael Baldwin, Phyllis Summers, and the one and only Victor Newman. These three have been orbiting each other for years, but right now, everything is shifting. It all started with Phyllis getting arrested. Imagine it, the lights, the cameras, and all that public humiliation she spent years trying to avoid. Her whole business empire and her identity were basically hanging by a thread, while the legal system just chewed her up. It really felt like the city had finally run out of second chances for her. But then Michael Baldwin steps in. Now, this wasn't just a lawyer taking a case, it was a massive declaration of war. Victor made his position crystal clear. Michael was not to protect Phyllis, and Michael, who has lived in Victor's shadow for what feels like forever, decided to step directly against that order. Can you imagine the guts it takes to look Victor Newman in the eye and defy him like that? Michael knows better than anyone what Victor is capable of when he's disobeyed. But then came those five words, just five. Michael delivered them so calmly with this quiet authority that just stopped the whole room. Even Victor had to pause and recalculate. It wasn't an explosion, it was a transfer of weight that the rest of the city hasn't even felt yet. But here's the real kicker, Michael actually knows Victor used AI to fake the evidence against Phyllis. Victor admitted he had fake emails cooked up by an app to use against her. So why hasn't Michael used that to get the charges dropped? Is he still secretly trying to protect his old mentor? Well, think about it. Phyllis is already starting to wonder if her own lawyer is actually sabotaging her. And then there's Michael's wife, Lauren. She's so proud to see the fierce version of her husband back again. But she's also scared out of her mind. She knows that when Victor Newman retaliates, it doesn't always hit the person who crossed him. Sometimes it goes after Newman, the people they love most, because he knows that's where the wound goes deepest. The funny thing is, Victor doesn't rage when he's genuinely threatened. He goes quiet, he waits, and that is the most dangerous thing about him. He's like a clock ticking down to zero in the back of your mind. Michael might feel free right now, but he's brought that freedom at a price he hasn't even finished paying yet. So, what do you think? Does Michael know enough to actually shake Victor's empire? Or is Phyllis just being pulled into a much bigger game that she can't control? Personally, I think this is only the beginning. Victor doesn't just strike when he's emotional, he strikes when no one is ready. What happens when his next month is personal and precise? One thing is for sure, people are starting to lose their fear of Victor, and once that happens, everything he built could start to crack. Stay tuned, because the next twist probably won't happen in a courtroom. For Michael Baldwin, the moment Phyllis Summers was dragged into custody felt less like a legal proceeding and more like the beginning of a war he never wanted to fight. The flashing cameras outside the courthouse, the reporters screaming questions, the whispers spreading through Genoa City like wildfire, it all carried the same message. Phyllis Summers had finally run out of luck. For years, she had survived scandal after scandal through sheer force of will, manipulation, and the refusal to stay down. But this time felt different. This time, the system itself seemed determined to crush her. The humiliating arrest ripped apart the image she had fought so hard to reveal after taking control of Newman Enterprises and rebranding it under the Summers name. In Phyllis' mind, the company represented proved that she could still win, that she could still stand toe to toe with the Newmans after decades of being treated like an outsider, clawing her way into their world. But the second those handcuffs closed around her wrists, the illusion shattered. Employees abandoned her, investors panicked, and even some of her oldest allies began quietly distancing themselves. Yet in the middle of that chaos, one man stepped forward when almost everyone else stepped back. Michael Baldwin. To the rest of Genoa City, it looked like a simple attorney-client arrangement. But underneath the surface, it was far more dangerous than that. Michael taking Phyllis' case was an open act of rebellion against Victor Newman, and everybody knew it. Victor had spent years treating Michael as more than just his lawyer. Michael had been his fixer, his strategist, his confidant, and at times practically his shield against the consequences of his own ruthless decisions. Their relationship was built on loyalty, but it was also built on fear. Victor expected obedience because obedience had always been rewarded. The people who crossed Victor rarely survived untouched. Careers collapsed, marriages broke apart, fortunes disappeared overnight. Michael understood that better than anyone, which made his decision to defend Phyllis even more shocking. When Victor confronted him privately and demanded the walk away from the case, Michael refused with a calmness that rattled Victor more than shouting ever could. The room reportedly fell silent after Michael delivered those 5 devastating words that changed everything between them. Victor expected resistance, maybe, excuses certainly, but he did not expect Michael to stand there with complete certainty and choose his own conscience over Victor's power. For the first time in years, Victor looked genuinely uncertain. Not because he feared losing a legal battle, but because he realized the foundation of control he built over people was beginning to crack. What made the situation even more explosive was the truth Michael was carrying. He knew Victor had fabricated evidence against Phyllis using artificial intelligence. Victor himself had admitted fake emails were generated to strengthen the case, believing the ends justified the means because in his mind, Phyllis deserved punishment regardless of how it was achieved. To Victor, morality had always been flexible when family or legacy were involved. But Michael was now trapped between 2 impossible choices. If he exposed the truth immediately, he could destroy Victor's credibility forever, and potentially send members of the Newman family into legal catastrophe. But if he stayed silent, he risked becoming complicit in the very corruption he once swore as an attorney to fight against. Phyllis could sense his hesitation, and paranoia quickly took root. She began questioning whether Michael was truly defending her or secretly protecting Victor behind the scenes. Their strategy meetings became tense and emotionally charged. Phyllis demanded aggressive action, insisting they expose Victor publicly before the prosecution could tighten its grip. But Michael kept urging caution, believing one wrong move could destroy any chance of her. That trust was temporary and loyalty always came with conditions. The more Michael hesitated, the more convinced she became that he was still emotionally tied to Victor despite everything. Meanwhile, Lauren Fenmore Baldwin watched her husband unravel under the pressure. Part of her admired the fierce determination returning to Michael after years of quietly serving Victor's agenda. She loved seeing him reclaim his independence and fight for something he genuinely believed in. But she also knew the terrifying reality of what happens when Victor Newman feels cornered. Lauren had seen it before. Victor never lashed out recklessly when angry. He became colder, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. He calculated every move with surgical precision, often targeting the emotional weak points of the people who opposed him rather than attacking directly. Lauren feared Michael was underestimating the personal cost of this rebellion. One evening after Michael returned home exhausted from another brutal day in court preparation, Lauren confronted him with tears in her eyes and asked whether protecting Phyllis was worth risking their entire future. Michael admitted he didn't even know anymore. He confessed that part of him still cared deeply for Victor despite everything, which only made the betrayal feel more painful. Victor had once saved Michael from destruction, given him purpose, and treated him like family when few others would. But now Michael was forced to confront the horrifying realization that loyalty to Victor often required sacrificing his own moral compass. Across town, Victor sat alone in the Newman Ranch study, staring out in the darkness with an expression Nikki barely recognized. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't plotting openly. That frightened Nikki more than rage ever could. Victor's silence meant he was thinking several moves ahead. Nikki warned him that framing Phyllis with fake evidence crossed a line even he might not recover from. But Victor insisted everything he had done was necessary to protect the Newman legacy from a woman he believed would destroy it out of vengeance and ego. Nikki argued that their family was already falling apart because of his obsession with controlling everyone around him. Nick was spiraling deeper into addiction struggles. Victoria was becoming increasingly ruthless under Victor's influence, and Adam was once again drifting into darkness trying to win his father's approval. Yet Victor remained convinced the history which justifies his actions. Once Phyllis was defeated, ironically, the more Victor tried to protect his empire, the more isolated he became from the people he claimed to love. At the center of all this chaos stood Phyllis herself, emotionally exhausted yet still defiant. She refused to present herself as a victim even as her world collapsed around her. Publicly, she maintained her usual fire, telling reporters outside the courthouse that the charges were politically motivated and that Victor Newman was terrified of losing control. But privately, she was unraveling. Summer's continued distance devastated her more than she admitted. Daniel's disappointment cut even deeper. Phyllis had convinced herself that seizing power at Newman Enterprises would prove her worth to her children. Yet all it accomplished was pushing him farther away. Alone in her penthouse one night after another brutal court hearing, Phyllis finally broke down, admitting to Michael that she no longer recognized the person she had become. Michael listened quietly, perhaps seeing for the first time not the manipulative force of nature Genoa City feared, but a deeply wounded woman who spent decades fighting for validation and still ended up alone. Yet sympathy would not save either of them from what was coming. Rumors began circulating that a whistleblower connected to Newman Enterprises possessed digital records proving the AI evidence had been manufactured. Christine Blair, now deeply involved in prosecuting the case, sensed the danger immediately. For Christine, this battle against Phyllis had always been personal, whether she admitted it or not. Their history stretched back decades filled with betrayal, violence, heartbreak, and unresolved trauma. Christine genuinely believed Phyllis deserved consequences for the destruction she caused over the years. But even she was disturbed by the possibility that Victor had manipulated the legal system itself. If the evidence turned out to be fraudulent, everything Christine worked for could collapse overnight, and her own reputation would be dragged through the mud beside Victor's. Paul Williams quietly warned Christine that she might be walking into the biggest scandal of her career. At the same time, Genoa City itself seemed to split into factions. Some residents believed Phyllis finally deserved to pay for years of chaos and manipulation. Others feared Victor Newman's influence had become so unchecked that no one was safe anymore. The media frenzy intensified, daily turning the trial into a spectacle that consumed the entire city. Every leaked document, every courtroom argument, every emotional outburst became headline news. Michael found himself under relentless pressure from all sides. Victor's allies treated him like a traitor. Phyllis demanded total loyalty. Lauren feared for their safety, and deep down Michael feared that exposing the truth might trigger consequences far beyond one criminal case, because if Victor Newman could be publicly proven to have fabricated evidence using AI, it would not merely damage his empire, it could destroy the myth of invincibility he spent decades building. And once people stop fearing Victor Newman, the entire balance of power in Genoa City changes forever. That possibility lingered over every conversation, every courtroom appearance, every cold stare exchanged between former allies. Nobody truly knew what Victor's next move would be, only that it was coming, and perhaps the most terrifying part of all was that Victor himself no longer seemed motivated solely by revenge against Phyllis. This had become something much larger, a fight to preserve his legacy, his authority, and the fear that kept his empire standing. Michael Baldwin understood that better than anyone. By choosing to defend Phyllis, he had not just taken a controversial case, he had stepped into the center of a storm powerful enough to destroy every relationship, every alliance, and every illusion Genoa City had relied on for decades. And as the walls closed in around all of them, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just about guilt or innocence. It was about whether Victor Newman's reign over Genoa City could survive the moment people finally realized he was not untouchable after all. As the trial preparations intensified, the emotional pressure on everyone involved became almost unbearable. Michael started spending long nights alone in his office, staring at stacks of files while replaying every conversation he had ever had with Victor Newman. He remembered the years Victor trusted him with secrets nobody else knew, the private meetings where impossible problems were solved with a handshake and absolute loyalty. Back then, Michael convinced himself that Victor's ruthless methods were justified because they protected the people he loved. But now the line between protection and corruption had become impossible to ignore. Every time Michael looked at the fabricated emails connected to Phyllis' arrest, He felt sick. The metadata didn't lie, the wording patterns were artificial, hidden coding signatures clearly pointed to AI manipulation. Victor had crossed into dangerous territory. And Michael knew if the truth exploded publicly, the fallout would spread far beyond this single case. It could trigger federal investigations, shareholder lawsuits, and criminal obstruction, charges that would shake Newman Enterprises to its foundation. Yet, despite all that, part of Michael still hesitated because exposing Victor felt like betraying a chapter of his own life. That inner conflict only grew worse when Victor unexpectedly showed up at Michael's office late one evening. There were no threats at first, no raised voices, just an eerie calmness as Victor poured himself a drink and quietly asked whether Michael truly intended to destroy everything they had built together. Michael answered with brutal honesty, telling Victor that the moment fake evidence entered the equation, there was nothing left worth protecting. For the first time, Victor's expression cracked with genuine disappointment. He admitted he expected betrayal from enemies like Jacobot or Phyllis Summers, but never from Michael. That statement hit harder than Michael wanted to admit. Still, he refused to back down. Victor then issued one final warning before leaving. If Michael exposed him, there would be consequences neither of them could control. Those words haunted Michael long after the office door closed behind Victor because he knew they were not empty threats. Meanwhile, Phyllis became increasingly unstable as public opinion turned against her. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse carrying signs demanding justice while social media exploded, with debates about whether she was a victim of Newman corruption or simply a criminal finally getting caught. The humiliation fueled Phyllis' anger, but underneath that rage was fear, real fear. She began waking up in the middle of the night convinced prison bars were closing around her. She snapped at Daniel during a tense family dinner and completely broke down when Summer refused to answer her calls. For all her bravado, the possibility of losing everything terrified her because Phyllis had spent her entire life reinventing herself after disaster.